While we are patiently waiting for a moment, I will point out that if you are a new arrival and are unable to stand during the actual event, we are also live streaming this event over in our travel archive, which is just to your right before you hit the wall. All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're so pleased you could all be here with us today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that, of course, McNally Robinson Booksellers is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Innuit, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Forever relevant is the fact that also beneath our feet, McNally Robinson Booksellers rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We're so pleased that you could join us here, both in person and online, for a very special afternoon with Omar El Akkad. The author of course, American War and What Strange Paradise, El Akkad is here to celebrate his nonfiction debut, One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. We're so enormously grateful to McClelland Stewart for publishing this book, and of course, for ensuring that we could have this event as well. Just a few very quick procedural details. There will be a presentation from up here before the conversation takes place at these seats to my left. There will be a signing afterward, and I will be back with some scintillating information about signing procedures, so please do stand by for that. The only thing I will put in your brain, and it is very important, is that at the close of the event, we'll ask you all to remain in place for one moment to ensure we can actually get our author to the table in the first place. So thank you very much in advance for your accommodation on that point. But now I would like to call up our first speaker for the afternoon. That is, of course, my boss, our co-owner, Chris Hall.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Hall, as John says. I'm one of the owners here at McNally Robinson. We gathered here today to talk about a new book, a great new book called One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. Omar El Akkad has made the journey to Winnipeg to tell us more about the book. It's a great privilege. This is an event that has caused us a difficult couple of weeks here at the bookstore. We have been threatened legally, financially, as well as physically. But we remain steadfast in our support of Omar's book. I always count on you. My response to all those people is read the book. Don't just read the synopsis and assume you know everything you need to know. There's no doubt that this book will make all readers uncomfortable, but that's what the best books do. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our host for the afternoon. David Bergen is a great friend of the bookstore, and we really appreciate that he has agreed to lead this conversation. He is the author of 13 works of fiction. I recommend all of them. His latest is the novel Away from the Dead from Goose Lane Editions. And in fall of 2025, we look forward to the publication of Days of Feasting and Rejoicing, also from Goose Lane. his first foray into literary crime. Bergen lives in Winnipeg. Please join me in welcoming David Bergen.
Thanks, Chris. It's a real pleasure to be here and to speak with Omar. I'm going to introduce him, and then I'm going to ask him to read a little bit from a section that I was going to ask him to. So I'm just going to move from my introduction right over to Omar and then ask him to read. And he said he will do whatever I ask him to. So here we go. I've never met Omar before except on Zoom, and this was over the last year and a half. We've been discussing things around the invasion of Gaza and the war and the genocide, and it had to do with our sense of what to do with a prize that we had both won, which was the Giller Prize. And there's something we will talk about later, although I know that Canada is the only place that seems to want to talk to you about the Giller Prize. The US and UK and Ireland are not as interested, but I think it's worthwhile. So this book, I'll begin by stating that each page of this book offers a new insight, a point of discussion, a revelation. And for me, it was incredibly difficult to not just find a quote from each of these pages and discuss it. But given time limit, I have some questions for Omar, and Omar is a good talker, so he'll give us a wealth of information and wisdom. The part, Omar, I want you, and I think you were going to start with this, right at the beginning? Yeah, begins, she is fog colored, and he's going to read just the introduction, and then we'll move into a conversation. But when I first read this, I cried. I think because so many of us have seen images of children pulled from rubble or without arms or limbs, and so when this child is pulled out, this young girl is pulled from the rubble, she's being asked she's being taken to the cemetery. So Omar, please. Yep. I just say, I didn't talk about your accolades and how many prizes you've won and stuff like that, but
Unacceptable.
bye.
Hello. So grateful to be here. Thank you. This thing's going to move, and I'm just going to move with it. Okay, it's settled. So grateful to McClelland Robinson for allowing me to be here, and for y'all for coming out to this. A million years ago, I was touring for my first book, this book called American War, and it had just won this award, so I was feeling very full of myself. And I got invited to a bookstore in Tampa, which later turned out to be, at least by volume, a scented candle store that also had a shelf of books. And I showed up, and my audience that day was 2.5 people. There was a couple who came up to me beforehand and said, we don't know who the hell you are, we haven't read this book, but we heard you're Egyptian, and our son-in-law is Egyptian, his name's Mohammed. And then they paused, as though I was going to say, like, oh, Mohammed from Cairo. I had to break it to them that there are 80 million of us, and chances are I did not know Mohammed. And then the other guy was there on the wrong day. He was showing up for a different author. And he was too embarrassed to leave because 33% of the audience would have left the room. And so the reason I bring this up is because just to say that this is not normal for me, and will never be normal for me again, and I'm very, very grateful for it. So my name is Omar, I'm a writer, for those of you unfamiliar with my work. I tend to start these talks by letting you know a little something about what I do. I write the most depressing books on earth. That's my thing. If you're looking to have your day ruined, you can try either of the novels, any of my short stories, you can come talk to me. Personality has a similar effect. The story I tend to tell for people who haven't read the work to sort of explain what I'm talking about here has to do with the Chinese edition of American War. One day I got a note saying that there was a publisher that wanted the Chinese rights. And I said, sure, great. And all I knew about this publisher is that they didn't like the title American War, and they were going to change it to something else. And so fast forward a few months later, I get a copy of this book. I obviously cannot read the title, so I give it to my friend who can, and I say, hey, what does this say? And he looks at it and he says, oh, it says nobody survives. So spoiler alert, if you haven't read American War yet, that is the sort of thing you're in for. This is the new Stone Cold Bummer. This came out a couple of weeks ago. At one point in the fall, the folks at Penguin Random House audio division called me up and said, look, we can't have anyone else read this, you have to go do it. And I didn't have that sort of background. I've never read audiobooks. I read an essay once for a friend's collection, and that was about it. But I had done this podcast that nobody listened to, so I had some experience of like recording audio, right? And during the 2 years of doing that podcast, the producers would constantly say like, listen, could you like just perk it up like a tiny bit, just give us something here, like, you know, deadpan is great and everything, but like, and then I came into the studio and I started reading and they were like, your voice is perfect for this. This is exactly what we need. So those two poor sound engineers had to stick with me for 3 days as I sort of stuttered and wept my way through this. I'm just going to read you from the prologue. I don't think there's anything you need to know. She is fog-colored when they find her. She believes she has ended. Like porters in service of some grotesque nobility, half a dozen men carry the stretcher out of something cavernous, something that used to be a home. And she, a girl of 9 or 10, is whisked away. Sitting on the stretcher, dazed and bloodied, she looks off to the side. She appears to be searching. The men who carry the stretcher move with urgency, as if the doing of care, of gentleness, can undo what has happened to this girl, to this place, to the bodies yet to be dug from beneath the rubble. Someone nearby asks God for revenge. Perhaps God is here somewhere, also searching. A soldier I met years ago who made the study of industrial violence his hobby once told me the first thing that kills when a bomb goes off isn't shrapnel or fire. It's the overpressure wave, air forced violently outward from the site of the blast. What you're supposed to do, he said, is drop to the ground and cover your ears. Breathe out. Empty your lungs before the air collides with and flattens them. Of course, if you're close enough, nothing you do or don't do will make any difference at all. He said the force of the overpressure wave weakens in proportion to the cube of the distance from the site of impact, which is to say, the most effective thing you can do to avoid getting killed by a missile or a mine or a grenade is to be far away when it goes off. How do you do that, I asked. Do what? Know when a thing like that is about to happen, know to be far away. Well, he said, and trailed off. A few minutes later, he was telling the story of a freak accident his daughter had suffered as a toddler, how carrying her to the emergency room was the scariest thing he'd ever experienced. Even in his line of work, even with all he'd seen, the scariest thing. As the men carry the girl out of what used to be her home, she asks if they're going to take her to the cemetery. One of the men says, "Mashallah, mashallah." In literal translation, the word means what God wills. A closer approximation of meaning, of one meaning, is something like what has happened is what God willed. But English, tasked with a word like this, turns stiff and monophonic, and mashallah is orchestral. To any ear that grew up on this language, it is clear that what the man means when he says this word is something else entirely. Something instantly familiar to generations who've heard it spilling out the mouths of beaming grandmothers at the end of piano recitals and graduation ceremonies and at the first sight of a newborn. Used this way, it finds its principal purpose as an expression of joy. Look at this wonderful thing God has done. MashaAllah. Language, too, forces the air from the lungs. Beyond the high walls and barbed wire and checkpoints that pen this place, there is the empire. And the empire as well is cocooned inside its own fortress of language. A language through the prism of which buildings are never destroyed, but rather spontaneously combust, in which blasts come and go like Chinooks over the mountain, and people are killed as though to be killed is the only natural and rightful ordering of their existence, as though living was the aberration. And this language might protect the empire's most bloodthirsty fringe, but the fringe has no use for linguistic malpractice. It is instead the middle, the liberal, well-meaning, easily upset middle that desperately needs the protection this kind of language provides. Because it is the middle of the empire that must look upon this and say, yes, this is tragic, but necessary. Because the alternative is barbarism. The alternative to the countless killed and maimed and orphaned and left without home, without school, without hospital, and the screaming from under the rubble and the corpses disposed of by vultures and dogs and the days-old babies left to scream and starve is barbarism. The girl on the stretcher believes she has ended. A man says to her, "Intizay, you are like the moon." Again, translation fails. There is no English equivalent to the lineage of this phrase, a lineage that runs through generations of old movies and love songs and family gatherings. Listen to the sly setting joy and pleading, raw pleading, that carries the words as this man tells the girl who lived when so many others died that she is beautiful beyond the bounds of this world. Zayd Omar. Something has ended here, but something else begins. The dead dig wells in the living. Thank you.
That hard to read?
Yeah.
And you've read it before.
It's the only part of the book that I've read.
Okay.
Yeah, I read it. First of all, thank you so much for doing this, by the way. I know it wasn't the safest bet in the world, and I appreciate it. Yeah, I read it shortly after I wrote it, which is not something I generally do. I'm very, very insecure about, it's gotta go, it's gotta go through like 50 drafts before you put it out into the world. But I was teaching in an MFA program out in the Northwest, and we were at it's a low res. Low res just means you meet like 20 days a year, 10 days in January, 10 days in the summer. And it was my first time doing it. I just joined the faculty, and I had cursed this residency so badly. We showed up at the hotel on the coast, and another person staying there died in the hot tub the day we arrived for our residence. It was just the weirdest, like the vibe in that hotel was very odd. And so I was writing it then, and I decided to read it the following residency because there were a bunch of students there and they have to read. It was part of their academic requirement. They have to go to a reading. And all of these students were reading stuff that was like, I wrote this afternoon and I don't care. I'm just gonna go out, let me know what you think. And there was so much courage in that room that I thought like, to hell with this, I'm gonna do it. And I instantly regretted it because I went up there and I wasn't.
Why?
I mean, I barely got through it here, and it's
Yeah,
like, so like to have that be the first time. Also, I think it's good for MFA students to know that the teachers also have no idea what the hell they're doing most of the time. It's not a bad lesson to learn.
Yeah, and it reads like a poem. It's a gorgeous poem.
Thank you.
Yeah. I want to, and you've had this question before, and it's about the origin of the title. And it says, I think in the introduction to you for this event that it has been viewed more than 10 million times. on Twitter was a tweet that you did, and the origin of the tweet. I was wondering what you were feeling when you wrote it. This was just a few days after October 7th, I believe. Is that correct?
Sometime in October.
Yeah.
October of 2023. I mean, this is sort of the same thing I feel about a lot of this book, right? I'm not a social media guy. I don't do it very well. It's not my thing. Back then I used to tweet like once a month. Now I don't do it anymore entirely. It's not, I don't know. As you can tell from these answers, character counts and limits are not my thing. I ramble. And so I sat down and wrote this thing about how, like, one day when it's safe, and when there's nobody left to hold accountable, everyone will have always been against. I have no idea why it gained the traction it did. To me, it seemed like I guess it's such a stupid thing to say about your own stuff. It seemed fairly benign as a sentiment based on everything I know of history. And for some reason sort of gained traction, and then you're CC'd on all kinds of weird side debates between people you've never met and will never meet. Independent of that, I had been working on this book. I had been sketching out ideas, and I started writing in early November, originally under the title The Glass Coffin. I had not connected this title at all. It was only after the first, maybe second draft was finished that I was at a meeting at the Penguin Random House building in Manhattan. And one of the editors was like, you should use that as the title. And it seemed to fit. But now I have to do this compulsory thing at all my events where I try to convince you that I didn't just take a tweet and stretch it to 200 pages.
No, we don't think that.
I promise that was not what happened, for whatever it's worth.
We don't think that. No, I think what I found interesting about the language within that particular, let's not call it a tweet anymore, the title, is that at first glance it seems definitive, as in this will happen. And then upon closer consideration, it glances at despair. And I think it is those two words, one day, which can sound very hopeful, but can also sound despairing in its hope. The fact is the Palestinians have been waiting for almost a century to go back to the land. And yet I think I might be throwing a Western mind at the concept of one day. When we lived in Vietnam, the answer not yet to a question was always the answer. Are you married? Not yet. Have you traveled to Canada? Not yet. And I wonder if you aren't applying the sense of not yet to the Gazans. Are they free? Not yet, which implies that someday they will be.
It's a really fascinating way to look at it. I mean, I was thinking I'm probably going to make some book recommendations in these answers, and they're all much better books than this, so please, on your way out. If you can only buy one, these other ones are the way to go. A few years ago, the US government passed this resolution, fairly toothless sort of declaration, effectively saying, hey, Indigenous folks, sorry about all the genocide, and got no attention, except the poet Layli Long Soldier decided to write a collection about it. It's called Whereas. Whereas we did all this horrible stuff, whereas, therefore, sorry, that kind of thing. You look at that time frame, right? Like you look at that's pretty after the fact, right? Like that would be an understatement. And I was thinking in those terms, right? I think one of the things that has happened, and I mean, look, it's a book that barges in through the door pretending to want to pick a bunch of fights, and I promise I don't want to convince anyone of anything. I don't want to argue with anyone. That's not where I am as a writer. The defining aftertaste of this book for me is a deep uncertainty. I've come unrooted from a way of thinking about my relationship with this part of the world, and I don't know who the hell I am on the other side of that. So there's been a kind of vehement response. I think it's a hard book to be ambivalent about one way or the other. My friend thought that maybe it wasn't going to go up on Indigo, and so he kept refreshing. And finally, months before the book came out, they put the pages up on Amazon and Indigo and all the big booksellers. And so the page came up. And he was like, check it out, you're on Indigo. And I was like, I don't care. It doesn't matter. Having nothing against any bookseller. It's just like you can't you lose your mind if you're hitting refresh. But I clicked on it, and there were already 2 reviews. And again, this book hasn't come out for months. And it was a 1-star review and a 5-star review, and neither person had read the book. And so what you're getting yourself into, right? And so some of the conversations have been like that. And some have been incredibly thoughtful and there's some that are the best possible conversations where both of you leave having changed your mind about something, something like that. But some of the conversations about this title in particular lead me to believe that there's some people who think two things once they read it. First is that I mean 2 weeks from now, which in my mind was never the case. That's not, and the other is that when that day comes, it'll be a celebratory thing. And to me, it's the exact opposite, right? Because you think of the number of people who had to suffer in between the moment where you imagine this one day and the moment when this one day comes. So that's when there's been a bit of a disconnect, I think, from some of the people who've read the book or who at least read the title, and where I was when I was writing.
The October 7th, some people have called it an awakening, not only for Israel, not only for the Gazans, but also for the world at large, because never have we had so many conversations about Palestine and Palestinians as we have since that date. And we agree that this goes back 100 years. This is not something that only began on that day. But what's interesting to me is that finally we are having conversations with people about Palestine. We actually can use the word Palestine without being slapped. And you do that so well here. You call out to liberal democracies for their hypocrisy. And I'm just curious, do you see it as an awakening? Or is that the wrong word?
Depends on what morning you're talking about when I get out of bed, sort of thing. I mean, look, I used to teach this class on political fiction, political writing in general, I suppose, and one of the exercises I would have the students do is imagine any book title of any book they've ever seen and insert the word Palestinian in there and tell me what they think would happen to that process of publication and reception if it was like the Palestinian Da Vinci Code. Like what would be, the response? For me, that's just not a narrative container that I grew up in. I grew up in the Middle East. A lot of my friends are Palestinian. It was not a situation where you hear that word and you think, something controversial is happening, right? But you also see it, right? Like we went on this school trip. We were going to Switzerland of all places. And there was a Palestinian guy on the trip, one of the students. And we had to go through like Amman and then another stop, and then we end up. But at every airport, because this guy was traveling on like the flimsiest travel authorization, whatever it was, it got to be the case that we would all go through security, and then we would all sit in the corner and wait because Buddy had to go into secondary, right? And like, some of you know this, some of you are aware of what I'm talking about, but the really interesting thing to me when I think back to that is, by the end of the first airport, we'd all normalized it. We didn't even need to be told to go sit in the corner afterwards. We were like, yeah, he's going. And like, the extent to which I became okay with that, and granted, like I'm a teenage kid, whatever, but like, this is carried on throughout my life. There's not a single thing, you're talking about this sort of indictment of Western liberal, mainstream centrism, whatever you want to call it. There's not a single thing this book indicts or autopsies or interrogates that I am not completely complicit in. Completely, not only complicit, but also having been rewarded for it, right? Like to this day, I will go through security and I'll probably be fine. Like now that this book's come out, I will not be fine, I get it fine, but like, but I have relatives who have the same name, same religion, same ethnicity, and they're not fine because they don't sound like this.
You talk about that in your book. You talk about how proud you were when you were able to acquire that, and it was fascinating to me that was an achievement for you, that you could go through a border and they wouldn't say, oh, this is Omar from Egypt. No, this is Omar from Portland. Yeah, and what passport do you use to cross the borders?
Depends which borders. I mean, I haven't renewed my Egyptian passport in quarter century.
Do you have a Canadian passport? In the US.
And I think about it in terms of like, because of the kind of life I've had, I have a particular relationship with the concept of the nation state. And I have no sort of inherent respect for the sanctity of the nation state as a geopolitical idea. I have no animosity towards someone who does. And in fact, there's a lot of days I wake up and I wish I was that person, because there's an entire sort of set of load-bearing beings that do a lot of the work for you, right? Like it was stand up and the flag and all of that stuff is great. It's just when you've been a guest on someone else's land since the age of 5, those concepts haven't taken root. I guarantee you that if my dad hadn't left Egypt and we hadn't followed him when I was 5 years old, that there is an immensely good chance that I would be like the biggest Egyptian patriot you've ever met, right? Like that's the kind of life you had, and so you live with it, right? With respect to sort of my relationship to this part of the world and being especially proud of sounding like this and being not scary, right? Like I think that is what is scary about this book. Honestly, like if we're being really honest, this, I don't think it's going to be remembered, but if it is remembered, I've said this many times, if it is remembered, it's going to be remembered as one of the tamest of its kind.
Yeah, you said that. Yeah.
You know, like you go elsewhere in the world and you see the level of anger. You see the level of anger, and it is immense. It is immense. And I think the scary thing about this book is that it doesn't feel far away. Like you might pick up this book and you might hate it. You might think it's an absolute pile of garbage, but you are not going to think it's far away. Because I've spent a lot of my time learning how to not be far away. Right? Like I get introduced as Omar. I'm not Omar. I'm Omar Muhammad La'ed, and it's nobody can pronounce the ayn. And so you get Omar, and then like I do that, right?
Yeah.
And so that I think is the dangerous thing about this book, not the contents. The contents is about 50% self-indictment. It's not, you know, like, but it's from here because I've learned how to be from here. And that gives it an entirely different kind of set of terms of engagement with the reader. In terms of like the actual content of the book, a lot of it is piecing together things that I had been able to look away from previously. But through the prism of the last year and a half, I'm no longer able to. You
do look in the mirror. You confront what's going on. You hold the mirror up to, we'll call us the privileged society. And when you say that you have, and I don't want to paraphrase for you, but you have found the voice to make this palatable for the Western view. Is there any other way you could have written it, or that you could have challenged us even more? It does challenge, obviously, but that I'm curious about how you approach the book. I think you're being far too hard on yourself. The book itself is it's not that tame, but that's from my point of view, right? And you say the rest of the world is much angrier than North Americans. Well, we tend to put our heads in the sand, and as long as we can go to Costco and buy toilet paper, we're happy. But you've had how about Ireland? How was Ireland? Was Ireland more? You were there too, right? I mean, they've been colonized.
I fucking love Ireland. Ireland is one of those very few places where you show up and you're like, I know nothing about this place. The weather is garbage, but for some reason I just feel like comfortable here.
I know. I was going to ask if you were going to actually, as a writer, move there because they don't tax writers.
Is that true?
That's true. It's the home of James Joyce.
There's gears turning in my head. It's going to be a real sales pitch to my partner when I get home. It's going to be. So this book launched a couple of weeks earlier in the UK and Ireland. Excuse me. Sorry, I'm not going to get you all sick. I can't. This is the bad thing about doing afternoon events during Ramadan is literally everything. The good thing about doing events during Ramadan in the morning or afternoon is that I can say the stupidest stuff imaginable and then just blame it on my low blood sugar. So it sort of evens out. So I end up going to the UK and Ireland before coming here. And it was really interesting because the larger scale media you would do, the more antagonistic the questioning. And it was quite instructive because I got to wade in, right? And wasn't even wade in, I jumped in the deep end. The second interview of the day was just like the most antagonistic thing. And it's fine. Like, I'm a grown man. I know what book I've written. It's fine. But you know, you would leave London and go to Edinburgh, the response would be slightly different.
Mhm.
Then you'd leave Edinburgh and go to Dublin, the response was pretty different. And I remember at the signing line after doing the Dublin event, there's a guy about 5 or 6 back, and I could see him coming towards me in the signing line, and he just looks pissed off. It's just dude built like a fridge, just angry. And I'm like, all right, here we go. He's getting closer, he gets closer. And he comes up to the signing table, does not care about me or the book in the slightest. And it's just like, we'll never stop standing up for Palestinians. It's in our DNA. Smashes his fist on the table, shakes my hand, and marches up. And I was like, dude, what a great interaction that was. I think, it's again, it goes back to this idea of what narrative containers are available to you. And how easy is it to pick one off the shelf, adhere yourself to it, and then be okay in your social circles and your professional circles and the kind of place you occupy and wherever you live.
Mhm.
And those are very, very different from place to place.
Yeah. Language. I'm just going to leap into a question here that maybe veers off a bit. You do talk about language a lot in this book, and you talk about the use of language to make the general population believe that all is okay, that this too shall pass, don't worry. And we see that in the language of war and the language of incarceration, where there are no prisoners, only detainees. And you have many more examples, and I'm sure you'll talk about them. But that, I would say, that's not terribly new. George Orwell introduced us to that in 1984 with doublespeak, where freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, etc. On page 71 in your book, you talk about the art of using language against another group, and I just want to quote here. These are your words. It is easy enough to focus on the words, the phrases, their plain malicious absurdity, but alone words can only obscure so much. The Bush and Obama era practice of labeling just about any man killed by the US military as a terrorist, until proven otherwise, is one of the most pernicious to come out of the post 9/11 years. It doubly defiles the dead, first killing them, imposing upon them a designation they are no longer around to refute. It also renders them untouchable in a polite society. For some, the worst plausible thing that could happen to them might be the ending of their bloodline in a missile strike. For others, the worst plausible thing is being yelled at. Why are we so afraid of being yelled at?
I mean, I think it exists at the far end of a particularly privileged spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
Everything at the end of that spectrum feels apocalyptic. There have been many times in my life where the worst possible thing was, a bad review or someone on Twitter saying something about, because my name's Omar, I occasionally get really angry tweets directed at Ilhan Omar, the
Oh yes,
the lawmaker, the Democrat,
Congresswoman.
And some days you're so privileged that that's the worst thing that's going to happen to you, is you caught astray from some idiot tweeting something racist at an entirely different human being.
Mm-hmm.
But if your day's going well enough, that's the worst thing.
Mm-hmm.
You and I are sitting here, we're talking about this book. And like, not to be presumptuous, but I don't think either of us are seriously worried about this place being bombed right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so we adjust our spectrum of plausible horror accordingly. I mean, look, I'm a bit of a coward, man. I want everyone to like me. Do I like the fact that there's people protesting me coming here? No, of course not. Then you wake up and you think, like, I don't know that there's a single thing that I believe that I genuinely feel certainty about that wouldn't change in a heartbeat if someone hurt somebody I love.
Mm-hmm.
Or if we were taken to the absolute end of that spectrum instead of the relative end. But like, I live in a part of the world where the bombs are manufactured, not where they're dropped. So I adjust my spectrum accordingly.
Where the politicians sign them.
Well, the politicians sign them or initial them, depending on how sheepish they want to be about it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was in Seattle and I was doing an event for this book, right? And The person I was talking to is this writer and an activist who's been working for a really long time in Seattle on anti-racist policy. And she was telling this story where there was a protest and somebody had been shoved or something. And so they walked over to the nearest security guard and they said, "This guy shoved me." And the security guard walked over and pulled out his pepper spray and pepper sprayed the first black guy he saw, because he just assumed, like, yep, yeah. And so, obviously there was there was a lot. There's actually like an event that was held where this person who I was talking to and a number of other writers and activists had a panel to discuss this, because it was so indicative of a kind of relationship between the individual and society in a deeply racist place. And one of the people specialized in the sort of economics of racism and was making the case that, well, yeah, you all are out for blood for this one security guy, but you need to understand that he's part of an economic system where he is given these orders by a higher level of corporate power and so on and so forth. And this is an economic system that has led down to this. And as he's describing this one white lady stands up and says, "I didn't come here for an economics lesson. I came here because I'm angry and I want to feel better." And it was like, okay, this is very instructive, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things that has happened quite clearly, it happens all the time, but it happened most clearly, I think, for me at least over the last year and a half, is that everybody has had no choice but to show you their spectrum of plausible negative effects. Mm-hmm. And for some people, it's your entire bloodline being wiped out. Mm-hmm. And for some people, it's an angry tweet, and we all behave accordingly, I think. Mm-hmm.
Along that line, and I know this is something that I think in your CBC interview this morning, which was recorded last week, I believe, the Giller comes up, and you say, well, the Giller is, the only time you're asked about this question is when you're in Canada. Well, we're in Canada now, and you and I met around this whole issue, and I think it's worth it to, well, for my own sake, and also just to throw it into the room. It's around this notion of being yelled at. And we first met via Zoom in early 2024 when we were discussing the Giller connection to the genocide. And I remember you saying at one point, and you were this little image in your office, and you said, quote, "Let's talk about the elephant in the room. I am an Arab speaker, a brown guy, who people
were you recording this conversation?"
I remember this conversation.
I don't have the wherewithal to correct any of this, but all right.
I don't record. I'm a brown guy who people will point at and say, of course, Omar is against the war, implying that your voice is a stereotype and irrelevant. That was then. But today, you are front and center, and your voice is very powerful. And it's like you have sort of shucked that aside and said, oh yeah, I'm Omar, and I'm going to say something, right? And as I understand it, you've turned your back on the Giller. Can you talk a little bit about your response to that? And also your response, and this is what I'm really interested in, your response to those writers who on the one hand write about the disenfranchised in their novels, and yet have said nothing about the genocide happening in Gaza. What about that disconnect? I know you've talked about this before, but I'll leave it to you.
No, that's perfectly fine. I think there's three parts to that question. I'll try and address them in order, but because my memory's shot, unlike yours apparently, I may mess up. The first is this idea of like, yeah, the guy named Omar, right? Look, man, that comes with the territory, and I don't care. You proceed accordingly, right? There was, in the middle of last year, I think, I was asked by a newspaper up here to write an op-ed that was related to the slaughter in Gaza. And I said, listen, I'm going to save you some time because I'm going to call it a genocide, and I'm going to say the Western governments are complicit and you're not going to run it. And the op-ed's editor said, yeah, you're right. And so we moved on. What was funny is that a few months later, earlier this year, I was asked to write an op-ed with the same paper, and I said, listen, man, I'm going to save you some time. I'm going to call it a genocide. I'm going to say Western governments are complicit. And he said, go for it. So what the hell has changed, right? Like, have the bodies piled up high enough? Or has somebody who's in a position of not being Omar cleared that road for me or laid those tracks down for me? I have no idea. I have no idea. All I know is that after that op-ed came out, But you know, the paper puts out a tweet or something saying like this, by they tweet out all their articles, and all like a bunch of the responses are just like, the writer is named Omar El Akkad. This is an op-ed from Omar El Akkad, and the implication is clear, right? Like that's all you need to know. This is the thing. But the thing is, like, it's never not been that, right? Like, I could have shut the hell up and it would have been that. I could have not written this book and it would have been that. The 10 years I spent as a journalist, right? Like, I wrote a story about the reaction to, I was the lead reporter on this case called the Toronto 18, which was a terrorism case. And I wrote this, got an FOI request, and I found out what the government was doing behind the scenes, and we broke the story. And like, I think the first comment was, I don't trust a story on terrorism written by a guy named Omar. And so like, you're used to it, right? Like, it just comes, I can't make myself small enough to not have that be a possibility. And so you may as well do the thing that, at least when you're on the other side of whatever this is, and this might be your own life, you can at least look yourself in the mirror, right? And so that's my thinking around it. It's not that there is some version of me that does away with all of this. I could change my name, I could change everything. That door is never locked, right? With respect to the Giller Prize, like, there's nothing joyful about what happened over that stretch. And the thing that pisses me off the most about it is the stuff that was said about you, and stuff that was said about Maddie, who is one of the most decent human beings I've ever met. Do you have any idea how badly you have to screw up to get Maddie to tell you to stop contacting? Like, it's just, this is Madeline Diane. If you've never met Maddie, that sucks, just on a personal level, right? Like that sucks. But it was also like that was the moment I was really proud of when I won that thing. And it made my career. And I know, like, it would be super disingenuous of me to sit here and be like, oh, the Giller was nothing. It was that nobody cared about that book, right? And then I got a positive New York Times review, and then I got nominated for the Giller, and it probably saved my career. The idea that I'm out here wanting to pick a fight and being like, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna set all that stuff on fire. That's the fun thing that I wanna get into today. It's ludicrous, right? This thing didn't start antagonistic, right? It started, at least in my impression, very cooperative, and then something turned and something got real sour. And like, this idea that I like picked on the Giller, I don't have a relation. I barely leave the house, man. I've seen more people on this tour than I have in the last 5 years put together. I thought there was a relationship there, and we offered solutions, we offered ideas, and then something turned real sour. And what did I actually do? I signed a couple of letters, I gave a couple of interviews. I got a lot of the attention because I won the thing. But like, the activists who've been working on this for years are the reason this thing got done. And it was small incremental change after a ton of animosity, which is how all change happens, right? So that's the second part. The third part is this idea of what writers, have I even been answering anything remotely related to your questions so far? Okay. Writers can do whatever the hell they want. They write about this, don't write about this, stand up against it, stand up for it. There are certain things that I've seen that have caused me to feel a certain amount of pain on behalf of that writer. Like, for example, when you're clearly trying to balance everything into a I'm gonna make everybody happy kind of statement or situation, that just feels painful because I think it comes from a place that a lot of writers have. And to be honest, that I think I have as well, which is this like, I can build a bridge. I can build a bridge. And listen, man, if we're talking about urban planning, if we're talking about 99% of topics, absolutely. This for me crosses a threshold that I can't do that. Maybe somebody else can. I think that by all accounts, if you're looking at this in a pragmatic sense, one of the safest things you could have done over the last year and a half was just shut the hell up. Just keep your head down. Just do it. And not only will there be really no consequence, the narrative avenues are going to be available to you after the fact. You can write beautiful, beautiful stories about the carnage. and about how sad it was. That will always be available to you, right?
Am I interrupting you here?
Please, no,
I
go ahead.
just wanted to insert this because this works very well. You quote the Palestinian poet Nur Hindi in a poem titled "Fuck Your Lecture on Craft, My People Are Dying," or Marwa Halal's poem. It's called "This Poem for Brad Who Wants Me to Write About the Pyramids," right? And I love that because this is where poets will interject. They'll say, "Show, don't tell," but that assumes most people can see. And those are your words. Your problem, along with Halal, as I see it, is that it is impossible to write about finches and sunsets and pyramids when a genocide is happening.
Also, again, two more authors whose books are far better than this, so please make up one of their most specific books. Exceptional work. I love writing about finches. I mean that in both terms. I love writing about it, and finches. I love the writing that is done about finches. I mean, my favorite writers write about finches. You can trick me into reading anything if the sentences are beautiful. I'm a sucker for that stuff. And there was, I think, a particular reaction to this book, and particularly that section on craft, on what the hell it is we do.
Yeah,
that I think assumed that I was saying everybody drop everything and write about this. And maybe you should. I'm not going to tell you what the hell, you write about whatever the hell you want. I think my issue was with, writers who, in a safer moment, are more than happy to quote Baldwin at me, who was a man who was largely despised in his moment because it wasn't safe. And there's an interview in the Paris Review with Baldwin when he was living in Paris, and the interviewer keeps thinking like, "Oh, isn't this a fun literary adventure you're on? You're following in the footsteps of Hemingway." And he's saying, "No, I had to leave the US or they would have killed me. Right? I was too angry to be a Black man in the United States." You're gonna, he got the sainthood after the fact, right? Enough time had passed. Yeah. One day he got the, and if you're gonna do that, and then in a moment that is so relevant to the kind of work with which this man and so many other writers were engaged, you're gonna turn and tell me what the finches are doing? Okay, fine. But I can't, right? And it doesn't mean the book's good, it doesn't mean the book's brave, it doesn't mean the book's necessary, it means none of that. It means that I have made a decision personally that if I can't write about the one thing that is consuming my mind because of some pragmatic after effect that might affect my career, then I don't think I can call myself a writer. And so again, maybe it is a selfish decision at the end of the day, but that's the logic behind it. I'm not indicting anyone for the art they wish to create. You create whatever art you want. This just happens to be the only thing I can write about right now.
You say, what is this work we do? What are we good for? And those are, I mean, everybody should ask that question. Have you ever, I'm sure you have watched Bolden on YouTube where he's talking, I think it was in Paris where he was living in. And at one point, he's wonderful to listen to, his voice. At one point he says, if you are hungry, if I am hungry, you are in danger, which I think is applies so well to what's happening today. If this is you've called the breakup, your breakup with the West.
No, the publisher has called it.
Oh, you didn't say that.
I can't fully disagree, but anyway, no.
Oh, okay. So this was not a romantic liaison that you had, where you're breaking up. So you still have some faith in the West.
I make the distinction between the institutional load-bearing beams of the West and the individual and community reaction. I've become, I think, fully disillusioned with so many of the institutional load-bearing beams, political, academic, cultural. I mean, you're watching these kids, I keep calling them kids because they're half my age, you're watching these young people who are students of these institutions who have immense privilege that's been afforded to them. They've been allowed in, right? And they've decided to put all of that at risk to protest on behalf of the people who can offer them nothing in return. And what does the administration, the institutional load-bearing beam that is supposed to protect these kids do? it responds with an immense amount of cruelty and physical violence. Your number one job is to keep these kids safe. You're not even a learning institution first. That's above that. You do that, and I can't help but think that there is a kind of bitterness there and a sense of betrayal. Like, we let you in. We gave you the key to a life where you don't have to think about any of this, and this is how you repay us? There's a real kind of viciousness to it.
Yeah.
But it also highlights that distinction, right? As much as I've become disillusioned about all of these institutional power centers, I've been so inspired by what people have done individually and in solidarity with one another. Like, I'm not a particularly brave person. I leech courage wherever I can. And there's been no shortage of places to leech it from.
So where do you leech it from? From these kids who are protesting?
From these kids who could have gotten their degrees and gotten these incredibly privileged lives and decided to do this. From the dock workers who won't load the missiles onto the ships, from the people chaining themselves to the gates of weapons manufacturers, to say nothing of the Palestinians themselves, the journalists who have quite literally given their lives to be the only source of information on what's happening in this killing field. It's an easy thing to say because, as I said up front, I write stone cold bummers, but this is, I think, the most hopeful thing I've ever written.
Yeah, let's talk about that. The hope at the end. You do lean towards hope. What did I had here? You end on a note of hope. Alongside the ledger of atrocity, you keep another, the Palestinian doctor who will not leave his patients, these are your words, the puppet maker who makes dolls to entertain the children, the journalists in Gaza who, even as they bury their families, keep reporting. And so do you take hope from those people, those people and their actions? And I mean, hope is a strange concept.
Yeah. I always go back to this Zoom thing I was on for a climate anthology. And the final question was like, what does hope mean to you? And everybody answered pretty much the way you would expect, except the last guy whose house had just burned down in the California wildfires. And he said, there is no hope. We've screwed things up enough that we can't fix it. We can't ever make it the way it was. There is no hope, but we must behave as though there is. And I think about that a lot, because sometimes I think I want hope as an opiate. You know, I make the distinction between hope as prologue and hope as epilogue. I'm not interested in hope as epilogue. I'm not interested in the idea that no matter how much we screw things up, things are going to be okay in the end. Because I think that's an abdication. Hope is prologue. Hope is a starting point. Matters to me.
It's also action, right? And you are acting by writing this book, by publishing this book. And you talk, I think it's about almost near the end of the book, about throwing sand into the wheels of the genocide. And even if it's a fingernail full or a handful, you just scrape it up and you throw it. And there are many ways of doing that. And this obviously is probably a dump truck full of sand, you know.
I don't know is the thing. That is a beautiful quote. It's a quote from a much better writer than me. So that's this idea of what is this, right? There's this principle in architecture where anyone who designs a structure should give some thought as to what that structure is going to look like as ruins. Mm-hmm. And I think writers would do well to think the same way about their books. You know, what does this look like as it decays?
Yeah.
And what kind of death is it going to have, and so on and so forth. And I'm in the very early stages of trying to think about that here. But like, after almost every event I've done for this book, you know, you go to the signing line or you talk to people afterwards, and somebody comes up weeping. And they don't give a shit about the book, and they don't give a shit about me. It's not that. It's the space, right? Like, I had someone in that Seattle thing, someone came up to me and was just like, can't talk about this at work because I'll get fired. I can't talk about this with my friends because they'll stop being my friends. And I feel like I'm losing my mind. And so, like, you know, if two activists pick this book up and bond over how much they hate it and they make that connection and that goes, that's worth the price of admission, right? Like, this is not normal for me, and it's not happening again. And I guarantee you that a big part of it is because there are people who feel like they're losing their minds, who have seen the most horrific things and have been told, accept this is necessary. And so just as a staging ground for a potential conversation about that, if that's all it does, I'm good.
Beautiful. Yeah. One last question. Have you ever wanted to be asked a question that you've not been asked yet?
Oh, Jesus Christ, you have to spring this on me.
No, you don't have to. Forget it. It's just, I was curious because sometimes when you always ask the same questions over and over again, you think, why don't they ask me this question instead? You know, this is, I mean, I have many more questions, but John, how much time do we have?
We've gone way over, haven't we? I just was staring at like.
Yeah, okay.
You know, I'd love to hear more about this new book.
Oh.
What do you?
Well, it's not throwing sand in the gears of genocide.
What is it throwing sand in the gears of? What is this thing? Give us the sales pitch, please.
Oh, no. The elevator pitch.
Hey, and this is my event, and I will wherever I please, and what I please is to hear about this new book.
Okay, so it's a literary crime novel called Days of Feasting and Rejoicing, and it takes place in Thailand, and it's a watch her do it kind of book. There you go.
I told you all you hear about better books than let's close with that. I like that.
No, thank you, Omar. It's wonderful.
Thank you very much.
I have the thankless task of saying anything after that. So at this point, I'm going to ask Omar to follow my colleague Angela over to the signing table. And I'll ask all you to remain in place to ensure that we can make that happen for just one moment. I know throughout that entire incredible conversation, you've been wanting to know what will be the procedure for getting books signed. And so I can share that with you now before I offer a few more words of gratitude. So in just a moment, Omar will be at the table. We'll ask that before you actually get in line yourself, that you please purchase a copy of the book. He will be signing, if you have copies of more or his other work, then he will sign those, but we just ask that you please have a copy of One Day in your hand, so that you can pass that along too. I'll be wandering down the line with Post-it notes, which is not because we don't trust you to be able to spell your name. It just ensures that you can spend more time chatting than spelling when you actually get to the table. I will, of course.
I don't know if it's out of order, but I would like to comment check on YouTube a conversation between Omar and Chris Hedges.
Chris Hedges? Absolutely. That's a very good one.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent suggestion. So the suggestion from the crowd was, if you have not seen it already, there's an excellent conversation between Omar and Chris Hedges, the journalist and author as well. So please do check that out. It's free on YouTube to watch. Thank you kindly. Oh, yes. You can certainly ask some questions at the signing table if you'd like. So when it comes to that, so we will be moving along to the signing in just one moment. I will selfishly ask you to allow me to actually get out there so I can start putting Post-it notes on your books. But I will just offer a few more final words of gratitude. We're so very grateful to McClelland Stewart, of course, for publishing this book, for making sure that Omar could join us. We're so incredibly grateful to David Bergen for hosting this afternoon. And before I ask you to join me in one more round of applause, it would be churlish for me not to say that despite all that we've received negatively, above all, we've received such positivity and support from you out there. So thank you for being here with us tonight. It's such an incredible privilege, not only to spend the afternoon with Omar and with David, but also to spend the day with you. Thank you all so very much for being here. Please give a raucously appropriate applause.